Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the weekend edition, and we are just thrilled that you can join us. And also thrilled around the round table, we have Lathan Watts, who is the Director of Public Affairs at First Liberty, as well as Dr. Merrill Matthews, resident scholar at IPI, the Institute for Policy Innovation. Since they're both unaware of the fact, we've picked up a few stations. I just mentioned it before we came on the air, but for those of you that are not aware of that, we picked up a station in Daytona Beach, Florida, WMFJ, and that is 1450 AM. And so those of you listening in Daytona Beach, welcome. And then on Wednesday, we picked up KKVV in Las Vegas, Nevada, 1060 AM. And so those are two new stations, one out of Daytona Beach, one out of Las Vegas. I have a rumor, too, that some more are coming online in the future. So I guess maybe they knew both of you are going to be with us. And so Dr. Merrill Matthews, it's just great to have you with us here as well.
Thank you for having me, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, get to the few things. First of all, let me give you an overview. Their jobs growth numbers are in, and they're disappointing. And we're going to hear from the president, who is trying to put a rose on that, which I'll let you decide how good it is and how effective he was. Then, in just a few minutes, we'll be talking with Jonathan Saenz. He was actually there for the oral arguments on this particular case, which came before the Supreme Court, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. Then we're going to get into many articles, some written by, for example, Dr. Merrill Matthews, one written by Lathan Watts, and a couple of others that we will get into. So we have lots to cover. But first of all, the non-farm payrolls increased in November by 210,000. Well, that wasn't real good, because the previous month they were 546,000. And I can remember a time, Dr. Merrill Matthews, when they were predicting maybe we'd have 1 million new jobs, and 200,000 is a lot less than 1 million, right?
It absolutely is. And they were expecting about 573,000. So right. I was listening to economists on Thursday saying we're expecting this to be a really good blowout jobs report, and it came in less than half what economists were expecting.
And again, we're going to hear from the president in just a minute, because he's going to talk about how unemployment rate fell. But again, the prediction was, Lathan, 573,000, and instead it only increased 210,000. And I've said more than once, when you pay people not to work, they don't work. And when you even stop paying people not to work, they still get into a habit of not working. And there are a number of individuals that we're going to be hearing in just a minute are very few are unemployed, but I think that's some people just haven't even bothered to look for a job.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Once somebody stops looking, they no longer count them in the unemployment rate, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But these jobs forecasts, they're always surprised, no matter what.
It's like watching a weather forecaster,
it is.
Only
it's
worse.
It comes in, it's like, oh, we added a lot more jobs than we thought was going to, or oh, we added less than half the number of jobs we thought we were going to. It's like, I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I would certainly not go to an economist for advice as to what to bet, because they're always surprised by the jobs report.
Well, as they used to say, economists have predicted something like 8 of the last 2 recessions.
That's right. Yeah.
But interestingly, the labor force participation rate ticked up just a little bit.
Yes,
So
true.
that's a positive.
Yeah.
And so that's good. Plus, the jobs report, this is the initial finding. They usually come back with a second
Revise
and
it.
third finding, and sometimes they revise it up and say, oh, man, we really missed it last time. It was much higher than what we thought. And sometimes they revise it down. So it's a bit of a guessing game these days.
It certainly is. Well, the president tried to put a better spin on it, so let's go to that because he wanted to talk about the fact that at least the unemployment rate fell to 4.2%.
Our economy is markedly stronger than it was a year ago. And today, the incredible news that our unemployment rate has fallen to 4.2%. At this point in the year, we're looking at the sharpest one-year decline in unemployment ever. Simply put, America is back to work, and our jobs recovery is going very strong.
President also talked a little bit about how some of those numbers have actually fallen.
Today's news means that unemployment rate has now fallen by more than 2 percentage points since I took office. That's the fastest decline in a single year on record. And it's about 3 times faster than any other president in their first year in office.
So again, just a couple of ideas that we can put on the table. First of all, you might also, first of all, notice that his voice isn't very good. Mm-hmm. He did later on have someone ask the question, Mr. President, are you okay? And he said, well, I've got a 1.5-year-old grandson and gave me the cold. And okay, got that. So that's part of that issue. It's not COVID. But these are numbers from November. Something's coming up, I think, December 8th in terms of whether or not you can work, whether or not you've been vaccinated. I wonder if that's going to have an impact.
It could have a very big impact because the issue of the vaccine mandate and federal employees and or contractors with the federal government. And I think they postponed the one for large employers back. I think that's in March or March, I believe it is. It's a February, March.
So when they published the final rule, lots of folks clicked send on their lawsuit the same day, including First Liberty Institute. We sued in the Fifth and Sixth Circuit, and the Sixth Circuit won the lottery to hear the actual case. The Fifth, if I remember right, granted a stay while the case is pending. So that OSHA requirement is not in effect, and OSHA came out and said they would honor that.
Right.
So that OSHA requirement is not in effect while that lawsuit challenging it goes forward.
But again, that's a big question mark about where it goes, because up until that time, there was a real concern that all sorts of truckers and federal employees of all sorts would just simply not show up on the job that day.
Right. And it's concerning for a number of areas, especially for hospitals that have that provide for Medicare and Medicaid, because the mandate's supposed to go to them. And a number of hospital workers have said, if you force us to get the vaccine, we're not going to, we'll leave the job. And you don't want to do that as you have a increase in a pandemic with more people going in the hospital.
Again, one of the questions that was asked the other day of the president had to do with the whole issue of the supply chain. And he said, well, do you remember back in the 1980s when they couldn't find Beanie Babies and Cabbage Patch dolls and things like that? So I'm seeing both your heads shaking at the same time. I don't think that was the answer that the American people were looking for.
Well, certainly not. And, back to the unemployment numbers too, a lot of those people that are back in the workforce were put out of the workforce by the government shutdown, by the lockdowns that were in place, right. Supposedly, to slow the spread for 2 weeks, and then people, ended up out of a job because of the tremendous impact it had on the economy. So before you start patting yourself on the back for getting people back in the workforce, let's maybe take some responsibility that you were the one that put them out of the workforce to begin with.
And again, we were talking about the federal government, but we look at various states. You look at those particular states that have very low unemployment rates: West Virginia, Georgia, Oklahoma, Utah, Nebraska, places like that. And then you have some that have very high unemployment, and that's California, New Jersey, New York, of course, Hawaii, Michigan. And you go, why is one different than the other? Any thoughts?
Longer and stronger lockdowns. And the president, in his address yesterday, made it clear they were not going to impose any lockdowns. Yes. Now, it's not clear he can federally impose any lockdowns anyway. But right. At any rate, he started out by making that assertion.
Well, I just thought to have a little fun. If you look at the numbers here, and this one comes out of the Wall Street Journal, why is one not like the other? Remember the old Sesame Street. This one is not like the other. And by contrast, you can see those that have just incredible unemployment rates had lockdowns and all sorts of mandates. Let's take a break, though. We're going to come back and talk about the oral arguments before the Supreme Court right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we enter the last month of 2021, it's worth reflecting on the last 2 years of the pandemic and lockdowns. We were told by medical experts and politicians that we had to set aside many of our constitutional rights to keep people safe. And we were assured that this sacrifice of our freedoms is only temporary. But are we setting a precedent? Who would have predicted that a virus would become the justification for some governors and mayors to lay siege to our civil liberties? If I told you 2 years ago that political leaders would close church services and huge sectors of our society, would you have believed it? Even many of the most dedicated preppers would have had difficulty believing it. A retired UK Supreme Court justice explained his concern. He said the real problem is that when human societies lose their freedom, it's not usually because tyrants have taken it away. It's usually because people willingly surrender their freedom in return for protection against some external threat, and that threat is usually a real threat, but usually exaggerated. Now, the other side of that equation is also disturbing. Not only do citizens willingly give up their freedoms, but governments are traditionally reluctant to give up power that they have been granted to them during the crisis. Once we give government leaders power, they find it hard to return to the previous status quo. Some of the worst threats to freedom can be seen in other countries where government leaders implement the most draconian of rules and regulations. America's dedication to limited government and federalism have provided some protection against such action, but the precedent has been set. That's why we need to be ever more vigilant and make good choices in the 2022 elections. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio with us today, Lathan Watts and Dr. Merrill Matthews. And we now have by phone Jonathan Saenz, president of Texas Values. And of course, the oral arguments took place earlier in the week of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And Jonathan, as I understand, you were there in Washington, D.C., so I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about what was happening outside the courtroom.
Well, it's great to be with you, Kerby. I was on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court on Wednesday, December 1st, which I believe is going to be told as one of the most important and historic moments ever in the pro-life movement. There was a case out of Mississippi that makes it clear babies are protected after 15 weeks of pregnancy from abortion. But more significantly is this is one of the first cases in decades that presents a direct challenge to Roe versus Wade. We could quite possibly see not only the Mississippi pro-life law upheld with this decision, but we could have 5 justices that vote for the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Now, that doesn't mean that abortion would be illegal throughout the United States. It would simply return it back to the states like Texas and others, where the individual citizens and representatives themselves, and many have already done this, have been elected and indicated that they would protect life from abortion at all, if not almost all, stages. And so a lot of excitement, a lot of optimism, and just a strong spirit that we have turned the corner on this issue. And that was heard from the justices as well. If you listen to the exchanges in the oral argument, certainly reasonable to have counted 5 votes for overturning Roe versus Wade and possibly 6 votes for upholding this pro-life law from Mississippi.
Let me just for a minute, while we're counting heads, look at the other side. You had 3 liberal justices, and it seemed to me kind of striking for those of us that had a chance to listen to some of the arguments that they weren't really trying to defend the constitutionality of Roe versus Wade from 1973 or even Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992, but basically really wanted to just simply say that it was a precedent that should not be changed. Now, Lathan Watts, I think, has a very good definition for stare decisis.
Oh, yeah. Stare decisis, from the Latin meaning, if something has been wrong for a really long time, we should allow it to continue being wrong because it's been wrong for a really long time.
But it is interesting, Jonathan, that they weren't arguing for the constitutionality of all it, but just simply that we need to keep the precedent.
Well, and that argument has become weaker and weaker with every year. And that's because the culture has moved on the life issue. That's because science has moved on the life issue. We know so much more about the baby in the womb than we did in 1973. And we know a lot more about the abortion movement with speakers like Abby Johnson, who were at the Supreme Court that day, who worked for Planned Parenthood in the abortion movement and switched sides and now is pro-life. As a matter of fact, Abby's going to be speaking at the luncheon we're having in Plano on December 8th at Glen Eagles Country Club. We've still got a few tickets available for that. And Governor Rick Perry, former Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, is also going to be one of our speakers that day for lunch on December 8th, next Wednesday. So look forward to seeing people. Tickets at txvalues.org. But and that's what a lot of times is necessary for there to be a change or an overruling, if you will, of the Supreme Court precedent, is not only a change in how we analyze these things in law and policy, but oftentimes going right alongside that is a shift in the culture, a shift in society, and you've certainly seen that on the issue of life.
And again, Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson. I mean, there's some very good examples of that. But let's, if we can, also point out that what is actually in the Mississippi law, as we pointed out earlier this week, is not radical. As a matter of fact, it's more in keeping with European countries. Most European countries, a very significant majority of them, actually do not allow elective abortion after 15 weeks. So rather than this being some kind of radical statement or radical change in this, it would actually be making the United States more in keeping with what we find in a lot of European countries.
No, I think that's valid, and that's one of the reasons why Texas Value submitted a legal amicus brief to the U.S. Supreme Court on this issue in support of the Mississippi law, really allowing the court in the state of Mississippi to catch up with what other countries are doing and really catch up with society when we think about the advancements and babies being able to live outside of the womb at such earlier stages. And so, in concepts like the undue burden principle, viability, things that lawyers may are used to hearing in these contexts and not so much the general pro-life public, but those were all up for the discussion. I mean, I just think that you're going to see a completely different analysis of these type of issues moving forward, not only by the U.S. Supreme Court as a result of this decision, but all the lower courts going under that. But it is a good reminder, right, that elections have consequences and they have results like a different makeup of judges on the U.S. Supreme Court. You've got Amy Coney Barrett, you've got Brett Kavanaugh, you've got Neil Gorsuch. These were 3 justices that are going to play heavily in the outcome of this decision and possibly overturning Roe versus Wade that were appointed by a Trump administration. And so when you think about what's coming up with the midterm elections, people think about, do their votes really matter? And I'm not one that thinks the Supreme Court should be the ultimate decider of these issues. I think that should be the people, but they certainly have a role. And if they will rule the right way on this, it will matter quite a bit.
So what do you think will be the pro-abortion's response to this if the Supreme Court comes up and either overturns it or goes with the Mississippi law? What do you think their actions will be then? I mean, they could be violent. They could just begin focusing on the states. What do you think the issue is going to, or they could try to change the court again?
Well, let's keep in mind this, and we've got great information about this at TexasHeartbeatLaw.com. Let's just look and see what's happened in the state of Texas. We have a heartbeat law that's been in place and been in effect since September 1st, okay? And in all, intents and purposes, that means abortions are not allowed once a heartbeat is detected. That's about the earliest time you could even detect a baby and a woman being pregnant to begin with. And so has there been some fallout in the street? Has there been a whole lot of things happening that are just over the top and crazy? You really haven't seen any evidence of that. What you have seen is the abortion clinics, they've stopped doing the abortions because of the threat of private enforcement of it. You've seen close to 14,000 lives we estimated saved because there's about 150 abortions on average every day in the state of Texas. And so I think it's a good reflection point to see, well, what's happened in Texas. We're already in a lot of ways in a post-Roe environment. There's a great website set up by our Friends Family Policy Alliance called AfterRoe.com. We already live in a culture that has already moved as if Roe has already been overruled, has not been changed because it's been criticized for so many years. And so, but, there may be some immediate reaction to some of this. You might see some protests. You'll probably see a lot of focus on elections and trying to get laws passed at the state level that can counter some of these pro-life efforts, but they're way behind. I mean, you've had a number of even Democrats in the state of Texas that have now switched to the Republican Party, if you want to look into the political side of this, because the life issue continues to get stronger. It polls over 50%. And so, the work that they would have to do, they'd be playing some serious catch-up, and I just don't think that's possible. And so I think there's a lot of momentum going in the direction of life. And I would hope that things don't become violent or there's not some quick reaction, but we might see that. But I don't think it's going to be at any level because, even a lot of people in their own party support protecting innocent human life.
Let me just mention for those of you that would like to write these websites down, get something to write with. And of course, we've already talked about txvalues.org. And of course, you can go to the website and find it there. But also, if you go there, you can find your way to the Texas Heartbeat Law, or you can just go to texasheartbeatlaw.com. And that's where you'll get these facts and figures, because I know most of you do not live in the state of Texas, but you can use this to help and encourage maybe some of your pro-life legislators. The best estimates are 14,320 lives saved already because of the Texas Heartbeat Law. There is a video there that gives you a little bit more of an understanding of the Heartbeat Law, and then just a lot of facts and figures that I would encourage you to take the time to read and pass on to others, because it illustrates kind of what Dr. Merrill Matthews is saying. What happens next? Well, we know what happens in the state of Texas. And for those of you that are in pregnancy resource centers, get ready, because these pregnancy centers that I've oftentimes had a chance to get to know, sometimes we've had them on the program, sometimes I've spoken at their banquets, they are busier than ever, and that's good news. So, Jonathan, thank you for being our eyes and ears up there in Washington, D.C. And again, December 8th at a very good venue. They can find out more at txvalues.org, and you're going to have some great speakers. And as always, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
God bless you, Kerby. Thanks for being there. Thanks for supporting us, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Let me just mention, too, even though I've been sending you to those websites, I might all mention our website. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Our take action item for this week is to talk about and to actually let your two senators know about the Build Back Better Act. And when we come back from the break, we might even get into a couple of issues. Dr. Merrill Matthews has talked about a few things in that bill that most people didn't know. Nancy Pelosi told us years ago, you have to pass the legislation to find out what's in it, but some people have already discovered that, for example, union lobbying would be tax deductible. Oh, tell me that isn't so, but apparently it is. And we have so many other articles by Lathan Watts and Dr. Merrill Matthews. And anywhere along the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And go to the website, pointofview.net, and find many of the articles we are talking about today. And we'll take your phone calls right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? pointofview.net/team, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back on again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to get to, in just a minute, the Build Back Better law, or bill that is in front of the United States Senate, and we'll talk about some of those issues. But since we did talk about the issue of abortion, and we talked about what would happen, since I'm sitting across from Lathan Watts, one thing that could happen is packing the court, an attempt to pack the court. But even before we get to that, I would have to say that Jonathan is relatively optimistic. Some of the people we've had a chance to talk to this week have been cautiously optimistic, and some are of the Lathan Watts philosophy that you can never underestimate the ability to actually capture victory out of the jaws.
Defeat from the jaws of victory.
You know, and all the rest.
Yeah.
I always get it backwards, but you know what I'm saying. To actually create a disaster out of this. And so what about this? If indeed the court comes down to a lot of ambiguity and decides not to decide, that may be the worst. But second of all, what happens if indeed the Supreme Court in one way or another overturns Roe versus Wade, or at least validates Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization? What about that?
So I'll start with that one first. I think the immediate political response will be, one, there's already a bill in the House that would federally legalize abortion around the country. Depending on the makeup of the House and the Senate next year, you know, who knows if that stands a chance.
And that doesn't have to be a constitutional amendment. That could just be statutory.
They could do it via law. That law would then, of course, probably be challenged in court and would start all over. But so I think that's an immediate response. And then two, I think if they overturn Roe v. Wade, the same day there will be cause to pack the court. Yeah. The left, the people that have wanted to pack the court anyway, this will be fodder for them to try to push the president to pack the court again. They've never really abandoned that idea since they proposed it, even though it's, you know, wildly unpopular. As far as, you know, oral argument, I listened to the oral argument, most of it. I had to step out and actually do some work here and there, but I heard most of it. And I was just looking at an old quote from Justice Thomas, where he said, oral argument is fairly worthless, but it is fun to pretend you're reading the tea leaves. But oral argument assessments routinely and regularly conflict with the ultimate written opinion. So even though when I was listening to oral argument, I thought it went about as well as could be expected. I thought the attorney from Mississippi did a pretty good job. I wouldn't say a great job. I thought there were a couple of times where the more conservative justices seemed to be asking questions that were meant to be kind of softball questions, and I didn't think he really hit them out of the park. But, you know, the Solicitor General of the United States arguing the government side and the attorney from Planned Parenthood, they had a rough day. And so I think there is reason to be cautiously optimistic. However, you also have to take into account just the dynamics of the makeup of the court. I'm not as convinced as other people are that it is a solid 6-3. You know, the three liberals are never surprised by their Supreme Court justices, ever, because they are living document people. It means whatever we want it to mean. So whatever the desired policy outcome is,
you know what they're going to say.
You can guarantee they'll find a way to do it.
Yeah.
It's always the conservatives who are surprised by their Supreme Court picks. And there's kind of a split amongst the six. Along the lines of, I think all six of them are fairly conservative in interpreting the Constitution from a textualist point of view. However, there's another kind of fault line between, I would say, the three most conservative jurists, Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch, for the most part, who are textualist and also are willing to overturn precedent. They don't seem to take into account this kind of amorphous concept of the reputation of the court, or, you know, the court as an institution. Whereas Roberts is almost singularly focused on that.
Seems to be his issue.
And Barrett and Kavanaugh seem to be a little bit more along the institutionalist line, that they are willing to be textualists in interpretation, but they're also a little concerned about the court as an institution and how it's perceived and so on and so forth. So there is kind of and I hate to even, you know, put it out there, but there is sort of a nightmare scenario that I hope does not happen, but it is possible, where the court splits three ways and you don't end up with any one opinion that has five justices on it. And without a majority opinion, you're left with a plurality, and there's no controlling opinion by the Supreme Court, which then leaves the lower court opinion in place, which the Fifth Circuit outlawed the Mississippi law, and which would also leave Roe in place. I mean, that would be a complete disaster, and it would be. I think if that happens, it's because you would have Justice Roberts trying to find a way to thread the needle in some way, uphold the Mississippi law, but also not deal with Roe. And if he can't get 4 other people to come along with him on that, so let's say the 3 liberal justices, Sotomayor, Breyer, and Kagan, they sign on to an opinion that says Roe is good law, Mississippi law should be overturned. 4 justices, Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and maybe Barrett, have the exact opposite opinion that Roe is bad law, it should be overturned, and the Mississippi law should be upheld. And then you have this train wreck of an opinion by Roberts that he tries to get everybody, anybody to come along with, and maybe Kavanaugh comes along with him, where he writes it so narrow because the only question they granted cert on was, are all pre-viability restrictions unconstitutional?
Oh.
Now, he could write an opinion that says, that's the only thing we said we were going to decide here.
Yeah, it could be.
And Mississippi's brief, in their cert petition, they said you don't have to deal with Roe to answer this question. Now, when they briefed the issue, they said Roe is egregiously wrong and deserves to be overturned. So if Roberts writes some, mess of an opinion that says, well, not all pre-viability restrictions are necessarily unconstitutional, and 15 weeks is okay, and we don't really have to decide on Roe. But he can't find 4 people to come with him, and you got that opinion out there with 2 or 3 votes on it, a liberal opinion with 3 votes on it, and a more conservative opinion with 4 votes on it.
You have a big question mark at the end.
You have no majority opinion, which then leaves the lower court's opinion in place.
Wow.
I hope and pray that is not the case. And if oral argument can tell us anything, it didn't sound like Barrett and Kavanaugh were inclined to go that route. Barrett mentioned things like the argument that this is somehow a burden, that pregnancy is a burden. Isn't that, how do you square that with all of these adoption agencies and all these pregnancy resource centers that women don't have to be burdened? They can give the baby up. You had, I think the hardest question for the Solicitor General was from Thomas, and he asked it 2 or 3 different ways.
That's right.
Saying, what right are you talking about?
Yes.
Where is this in the Constitution?
Yeah, that was so good.
And he said, he's like, if we're talking about guns, we're talking about the Second Amendment, I know what this is grounded in. If we're talking about the Fourth Amendment, I know what right we're talking about. What right are you talking about? Are you talking about abortion? Are you talking about bodily autonomy? Are you talking about... And the Solicitor General didn't really have a good answer for it. In fact, one of the things that I found, mildly entertaining was listening to the U.S. government lawyer talk about bodily autonomy. I was like, well, that's a hoot, since it's the federal government trying to tell people they must take something and inject it into their body. And now you're here in front of the Supreme Court talking about bodily autonomy.
Exactly right. The one thing I did hear different is in listening to liberal commentators and the left afterwards. Typically, after one of these close things, you'll hear them say, well, we saw some issues, but here's some things we heard positive. I heard none of that from the left this time. They all seem to think this is likely going to be either adjusted or overturned.
That's true.
I will get to some phone calls, but I thought you mentioned something in passing, and some people might say this idea of wanting to pack the court, is that just Lathan Watts? No, yesterday we posted a piece by Jonathan Turley, who wouldn't necessarily agree with a lot of things we talk about here as a professor at George Washington University. The Democrats threatened Supreme Court over abortion. Their revolution will destroy fair, impartial judicial system. And he went through and named names and gave quotes to various senators that made it very clear. One in particular standing on those very same steps of the Supreme Court, like Jonathan Saenz was, not to confuse him with Jonathan Turley, in which he simply says, if you don't do the right thing, basically, if I can paraphrase that, and he's got all the quotes. So again, Jonathan Turley, who's hardly your wide-eyed radical reactionary, is saying, some of these individuals have been threatening the court. And frankly, when Trump seemed to even be arguing against the court, not necessarily threatening them face-to-face, the way Barack Obama did. Remember when that was a case in front of the State of the Union address? We said that was wrong. He said that was wrong. Of course, he didn't mention Barack Obama. He just mentioned Trump because, he wanted to get a Trump bash in there. But the point he's making is, if you think this is just something that few people at First Liberty are concerned about, Jonathan Turley and a lot of others are convinced that if indeed this decision comes down the way many of us hope and pray that it does, they'll be talking about court packing like never before. Got some phone calls. We'll take those right after these important messages.
Of the books around my house meant for grandkids, Eric Carle's The Very Hungry Caterpillar has been read the most, often several times at one sitting. The babies want to poke their little fingers through the nibble holes in the various foods the caterpillar eats. The older ones want to count the fruits, identify the days the caterpillar consumes them, and name the other treats he eats his way through. Then, children and adults alike gasp at the beautiful butterfly, the book's final illustration, which Washington Post writer Emily Langer describes as a panorama spread over 2 pages in which light seems to shine through the creature's wings as if through the stained glass windows of a European cathedral. Writer and illustrator Eric Carle died 6 months ago. Ms. Langer, who wrote his obituary for the Post, describes his hallmark collage illustrations, which he created by layering hand-painted tissue paper, as part of his effort to show children a world that was filled with beauty, despite the darkness he had intimately known. Mr. Carle was the son of German immigrants to the United States. The family returned to Stuttgart in Nazi Germany. He remembers hiding in a cellar during World War II as bombs fell. He told National Public Radio, during the war there were no colors. Everything was gray and brown. But an art teacher secretly introduced him to Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse and other famous painters disdained by the Nazis. After a New York advertising career that began in 1952, Eric Carle in 1967 illustrated Brown Bear, What Do You See? And found his calling. The child inside me, he said, was beginning to come joyfully back to life. Mr. Carle wrote The Very Hungry Caterpillar in 1969. Ms. Langer's piece points to the caterpillar's eating frenzy as a reaction to wartime deprivation and suggests the story may be Christian allegory, a message of hope. It's no wonder we're still reading it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In studio with us today, Lathan Watts and Dr. Merrill Matthews. And let's take some phone calls. We'll go out to Georgia, first of all, on the Good News Network. Wayne, I understand you've been a legal assistant. I'd love to hear your story.
Yes, sir. I was a paralegal for an attorney, a capital defense case in Augusta, Georgia. It was a case of first impression right after Georgia had passed a feticide law. Worked for a defense attorney, and part of my job was to research things for 2 attorneys because of the capital offense. And through my research with doctors and stuff about when life began, when I presented everything that I had found to these 2 attorneys, I found myself in a room with 2 attorneys crying and on their knees who had previously supported abortion and decided that now they could no longer support abortion, even though they had to defend his client because life had actually began at conception.
And again, I think as an illustration of course, I'm holding up right now a little booklet that we've done on some of the biblical arguments, medical arguments, legal arguments, and philosophical arguments against abortion. But again, when people really understand what it actually entails, and we've heard from individuals that have worked in Planned Parenthood clinics and telling some of these gruesome stories, that really does affect the ideas that people might have about that. And there is a real deliberate attempt, I think both of you would agree, to try to even pretend to not even get into the details of what abortion is, to put it as an issue of choice and not even talk about the gruesomeness of what a typical abortion entails.
Right, and they have to avoid those kinds of things, the heartbeat issues and other things, so that they keep it as this is just tissue, and that makes it less human and less emotional.
Yeah, and Justice Sotomayor kind of waded into that yesterday and completely bungled it because she mentioned in a question, it was kind of half question, half comment. She's like, well, to say that because we have better technology now and we can actually see the fetus recoil, that doesn't necessarily mean the fetus is experiencing pain.
Oh, I just
because
I rolled my eyes at that one. Yes,
and her illustration to quote prove her point was because dead people sometimes react to stimulus, and like you can poke a dead body and it will still move sometimes, and so we don't necessarily know that they're recoiling because they're in pain just because they recoil. And I as I was listening to it, I was like, well, you almost just admitted that's a person. Because if that's your comparison, that a dead person can recoil,
yes, then
you're basically saying that's not a clump of cells, that's a person.
Yes.
And if it's a person, it's entitled to the protection of life and liberty and property without due process. And which was a point that Kavanaugh made.
Right.
That he said, whether it's 15 weeks, 27 weeks under Roe, the balancing of interests, at some point you're talking about two different lives.
Right.
Two different lives.
Right.
And you don't have continuity. You can't balance those. There is no middle ground. No. You can't balance one person's right to life with, somehow a right to end somebody else's life. And so that was one of the things that, like I said, it's dangerous trying to interpret oral argument, but I was, cautiously optimistic to hear Kavanaugh raise that point.
Sounds good to me. And again, there's two issues. Number one, we were just talking about with Wayne, life begins at conception. I mean, you can look at any genetics textbook or any fetology, embryology textbook. They'll agree that life does. So you have to get to the second one, and that is it a person? Because the 14th Amendment only protects persons. So they changed life and personhood. But again, that's just all sorts of legal gymnastics to try to make that work.
Which is why, as Jonathan pointed out, that the U.S. Solicitor General never tried to avoid any discussion of what abortion is and the science that's involved. And her entire argument was on respecting precedent. Well, Roe is that's all you got precedent, so it must be adhered to. Because we barely had sonograms when Roe was decided. Right. So to Jonathan's point that the culture has moved because technology has improved, and that if you want to talk about viability, can that baby survive? Well, babies can survive
because of neonatology.
Much earlier than 27 weeks.
Yep. Well, and again, we could stay on this all day, and if you want to ask a question or make a comment, we'll get some more of those phone calls later. But I wanted to get to one of the pieces by Dr. Merrill Matthews, because we have been encouraging our listeners first to contact the representative when this was before the House of Representatives, the Build Back Better Act. Now it's before the Senate. But Dr. Matthews, you also found a few other things, and not the least of which is this Build Back Better bill actually gives some real benefits to some of the friends of Joe Biden, and one of those are labor unions. What about that?
Well, that's right. In the bill that the House passed, labor unions, members of labor unions would be able to write off on their taxes, above the line write-off, up to $250 of their union dues. And so that's an attempt to try to help their labor union friends. And I point out in the piece that one of the principles that have been around for a long time is that nonprofit organizations, 501c3 organizations, which is what IPI is, we're prohibited from doing specific lobbying on bills, supporting specific candidates, opposing certain bills, opposing certain candidates, because the notion was people shouldn't be able to sort of subsidize people donating to political issues that way. So this has been a sort of a long-standing presence. Well, unions are political. I point in there.
No surprise.
Open Secrets I think it was $34 million this year so far.
That's
lobbying.
Right.
If you're able to write off part of your union dues going in there, you're in essence tax subsidizing lobbying from unions that support the Build Back Better bill or the infrastructure bill or various candidates and other things.
And so, again, this is one of those pieces that just add to the very long list. If you go to our website, pointofview.net, that middle section there gives you an opportunity to contact your two senators, and we give you a long, long list. And you can add Dr. Merrill Matthews as one more reason why of course, there's quite a number of others in terms of spending billions of dollars to strengthen tax enforcement activities, money supposedly fighting crime. We're going to get into that a little bit later. But just the incredible cost of all of this, and some of the toxic ideas that are there. So go in there, type in your zip code, which I'm doing right now, and up pops my two United States senators. So I would imagine you probably know your two senators, but you might not know how to contact them, or you might say, I'm not sure what to say. Well, we give you a sample letter, and you can then edit it any way you want. But Lathan, when we look at this, we're just learning more and more bad things are stuck in this bill. And given the fact that this bill is longer than most books that individuals would read, it's not surprising that tucked in the way are some things that are really not good for America.
Yeah, sunlight is always the best disinfectant. So, the best thing, the best way to kill a bad bill is to read it, because you will then find all sorts of reasons to vote against it, including this one. And this is, it's a giveaway to organized labor. I think it's also a way of trying to kind of counteract the Supreme Court decision, the Janus decision, which said that union members who do not want their dues to be used to lobby in support of or being given to political donations to candidates they don't support don't have to. They don't have to participate. And so I think that's, the Biden administration trying to get around or at least counteract that Janus decision as well.
The particular book that we've been talking about off air is The Count of Monte Cristo, and they said that if you read The Count of Monte Cristo at 300 words per minute, it would still take you 1 day, 2 hours, and 16 minutes to finish that nonfiction one. But if you tried to read this bill, it would take you basically 5 days, and that's assuming you could read through it. Of course, a lot of it has connections to the Federal Register and stuff like that. So even at this late date, we're finding toxic things that are in the bill, and another good reason to vote against it. Anyway, we're going to take a break, and we'll take some more phone calls right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, let me encourage you to find some of the articles we're going to be talking about this hour. We spent a lot of time on the issue of abortion, and of course we had posted many of those articles earlier in the week. Just a few minutes ago, we talked about the Build Back Better bill, and we will come back to that because, after all, Dr. Merrill Matthews has wondered whether or not this Senate bill would actually reduce inflation or actually make it worse. I think we all know the answer to that, but his piece there is certainly one that we will look at. We talked about, of course, the union lobbying and the rest. Before we're all done, we're going to talk about did we learn some things from the 2020 election and even more recently from this House election in terms of these mail-in votes getting tossed. So we'll talk about that and even get into whether or not crime really does pay. I think you know the answer to that one as well, because we've talked about that in this booklet on a biblical view on criminal justice. But we almost always on a Friday like to talk about religious liberty, and since we have Lathan Watts here, the first article we've posted, I think it's the first one, is from the Washington Examiner, and the comment is Biden administration attacks religious liberty. Well, what a surprise.
Yeah.
Tell us more.
So I don't get to write the headlines when they decide to run one of the pieces. I think the original title that I gave to it was Biden's Foxes Guarding the Hen House.
Yes.
So
very good.
And this came out Monday. So there's an old adage in politics that personnel is policy.
Right.
And Javier Becerra, being the secretary of HHS,
oh yes,
just recently kind of announced two different positions. One was that he was going to reverse the Trump administration's tactic of having within HHS there is the Office of Civil Rights. And the Trump administration had basically centralized everything to do with complying with the First Amendment and RFRA from HHS in the Office of Civil Rights, which makes sense. I mean, those are civil rights, and that's what that office
makes sense to me.
Takes care of. Becerra wants to say, well, they might have given the OCR maybe too much responsibility, so we're going to carve some of that back, which means it would probably be more directly under him. Now, Becerra was most famous for suing the Little Sisters of the Poor when he was Attorney General of California to force Catholic nuns to provide contraception and abortifacients. So to say that that he's going to be in charge of protecting religious liberty when it comes to health and human services is laughable. So that was one position that he announced. And then another one, he said he was going to require faith-based nonprofits who work in the area of adoption and foster care basically to abandon their religious beliefs on marriage in order to continue partnering with the government to help kids get placed into adopted homes or into foster care. That's in direct contradiction to the Supreme Court's
that's just most recent decision.
Fulton versus Philadelphia, the last term, which was 9-0.
Yeah.
Okay. It's pretty gutsy to say you're going to go against a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court. But they're getting more and more brazen in their attacks on religious liberty under this administration. And this is just HHS. This comes on the heels of Biden's Attorney General, Merrick Garland, sicking the FBI on law-abiding citizens who show up to school board meetings. And to say nothing of his nominee for, I think it's comptroller of the currency, which regulates the banking system in this country, who did her doctoral work at Moscow State University.
And won the Leonard Award.
Wrote her dissertation on Marx and has said she wants to end banking in this country as we know it. She has said that she would be an advocate of getting rid of the private banking system and have everything run through the Federal Reserve. Personnel is policy. Yep. And these are the people that this president is putting in positions of extreme authority. And that's why I say, Fox, meet Henhouse. Yeah. When somebody who wants to abolish the private banking industry is now in charge of regulating banking in this country, or could be.
Yeah, I think her days are numbered because even some Democrats have said, no, that's a bridge too far. Go ahead.
When they had her hearing, she basically said, well, I said those things. Those have been years ago. So Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina began reading statements from her, which were within the last year or so, I believe was. And once again, it just put a lie on her face for what she was trying to do.
Yeah. And Senator Kennedy, I'm not sure I should repeat that, said, I don't know if I should refer to you as professor or comrade. But anyway, her nomination is going nowhere. But it gets us back to a key point. I was surprised that there wasn't more controversy over this particular individual as Secretary of Health and Human Services. Our listeners in the area of California, we have California stations, and they know what it was like to live under him in California. And so the fact that he wasn't as controversial as he was something. But you have to begin to wonder, are there some people in the White House that think, well, there's not a snowflake's chance that we're going to get somebody from Moscow State University to run the banks, but we're going to do it anyway, just maybe it can soften them up, or whether they honestly believe that this individual could have that position.
Yeah, either one is bad, right? I mean, if they actually think this is a good person to run that show, that's bad. Or if they're using her as sort of the stalking horse so that the person that they actually want, looks better by comparison. Either way, I mean, it's not good for the country.
It is just something that you never would have anticipated. I mean, again, Dr. Matthews and I are a little bit older than you are, so we were saying, I didn't even ever think that we would have a socialist running seriously in one of the major parties, but I didn't think that we'd actually get somebody who essentially was a communist actually going to be on that particular cabinet and not necessarily be at least a covert communist. We had some of those in the 50s, but that's just amazing to me.
And you have a person who was engaged, at least tangentially, in eco-terrorism.
Right.
I can't remember her name right now, but she was being put forth for it, I think, at someplace at the EPA or something of that nature. And you sit there and think, okay, so we got an eco-terrorist and we got a communist. And the surprising thing is their views are not that far outside of the mainstream of the Democratic Party right now.
Right.
No, because remember, Biden campaigned in the primaries. He was the moderate.
Yes.
Remember? He was going to be like the sensible one.
That didn't turn out so well for everybody.
And there were people saying back then, it had doubts about Biden's capacity to actually be the president. And if that's the case, then the people underneath him are even more important. And these are the people that he's putting in place. So, elections have consequences. We all know that. There's another election coming. And, if the R's don't snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, getting control of the House and the Senate to act as a check on the executive might be able to slow some of this down long enough that it doesn't have, damaging long-term consequences.
We need to take a break, and when we come back, I wanted to ask you real quickly, because you have a case before the Supreme Court.
Yes, we do.
And our listeners in Maine are familiar with it, but most of our listeners around the country are not familiar with it, so I thought we would at least make that a prayer target. And then I do want to come back to Dr. Merrill Matthews, because we've been told that actually this Senate bill won't cost us anything. Number two, that it will actually help with inflation. But I can see your article, and you seem to disagree, so we're going to get into that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we enter the last month of 2021, it's worth reflecting on the last 2 years of the pandemic and lockdowns. We were told by medical experts and politicians that we had to set aside many of our constitutional rights to keep people safe. And we were assured that this sacrifice of our freedoms is only temporary. But are we setting a precedent? Who would have predicted that a virus would become the justification for some governors and mayors to lay siege to our civil liberties? If I told you 2 years ago that political leaders would close church services and huge sectors of our society, would you have believed it? Even many of the most dedicated preppers would have had difficulty believing it. A retired UK Supreme Court justice explained his concern. He said the real problem is that when human societies lose their freedom, it's not usually because tyrants have taken it away. It's usually because people willingly surrender their freedom in return for protection against some external threat, and that threat is usually a real threat, but usually exaggerated. Now, the other side of that equation is also disturbing. Not only do citizens willingly give up their freedoms, but governments are traditionally reluctant to give up power that they have been granted to them during the crisis. Once we give government leaders power, they find it hard to return to the previous status quo. Some of the worst threats to freedom can be seen in other countries where government leaders implement the most draconian of rules and regulations. America's dedication to limited government and federalism have provided some protection against such action, but the precedent has been set. That's why we need to be ever more vigilant and make good choices in the 2022 elections. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, just do kind of Economics 101, one of the articles that we have posted here by Dr. Merrill Matthews. I just say, well, the Senate bill worsen inflation, and it gets back to a couple of issues, and that is, it's again the Build Back Better Act, which passed the House, really on a party line vote. There was one Democrat voted against it, but basically all the Republicans voted against it, all but one Democrats voted for it. Well, you have some real questions right now in the Senate as to whether or not you have even 50 Democrat votes. But you still, in the midst of this, Dr. Matthews, have people making statements, and this is including the president himself. This won't cost us anything. This will help with inflation. And you've looked at the numbers, and it's our second article. I want you to maybe just give us some information that maybe we can use when we write our letters or our emails to our two United States senators.
And the interesting thing is that some Democratic economists are saying that. So Larry Summers, back in February, wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying he was concerned that this was the spending, and this was looking for the American Rescue Plan. This was before the American Rescue Plan was going to add significantly to inflation. The White House disagreed and sort of disowned him a little bit. They later on came and said, well, maybe we pushed back a little too hard on that. And then you have Jason Furman, who was in the Obama White House as an economist, and he came out just a month or so ago saying, a month or 6 weeks ago, concerned that it was going to be the infrastructure bill and the other stuff was going to be increasing inflation. And they're pouring kerosene on the fire. That's a quote from him. But both of them got the memo, and then in November they said, yes, we're still concerned about inflation, but we don't think the Build Back Better thing would add to inflation whatsoever. In fact, it might actually help the inflation situation out there. And so now they have no integrity. And they're coming back and saying that if you flood the country with that much borrowed money, that it's not going to affect the inflation. Now, we found out this week that Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, is even coming back and saying, well, we thought it was going to be transitory. It's just not going to be as transitory as we thought it was going to be.
Shovel ready wasn't as shovel ready as we thought.
That's right.
Yeah. Let me just mention, this was in The Hill, and I loved the title they gave to it, because, again, you don't always own your own title. Liberal economists got the memo. And I might just hold up this one. This is our booklet we sent out just recently. When you print as much money as the Federal Reserve has had to print, because, again, for the technical aspect, China is no longer buying our treasuries, and no one else is buying their treasuries, then the Federal Reserve has to print money, if you will, to have enough money to buy the treasuries. Now they're talking about trying to taper eventually the amount that's going to be purchased. But when you have too many dollars running against and running around the same amount of goods and services, then that's by definition inflation. And we went from there's no inflation to inflation is transitory. I'm starting to see articles now saying inflation is good for you.
Yeah.
And
somewhere along the line, we need to just bring some
that has been the case as well. And fair people will look at this and say, we've gotten increases. The Social Security Administration said they're going to provide a 5.9% increase. That's the largest they've done in a long time.
Yes, it is.
Because they're trying to keep up with inflation. So I still think if we get the supply chains if those sort of settle down a little bit, you'll see a little competition and pressure coming back. But a lot of this is already built in now with higher wages, higher house prices, and other things of that nature, and that's not going to go away.
Yes.
Yeah, and when Social Security does something like that and they up how much they're going to pay, I mean, Social Security is already on a road to bankruptcy.
Yes,
and so now they're paying out more, which exacerbates that problem. The other problem that doesn't get as much attention when you talk about the debt is that with all of the public debt out there in the market, it crowds out private sector access to capital.
Yes.
Private sector businesses need to be able to borrow money. And when there's that much public debt out there, it's like the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It occupies all the space, and it keeps private investors or private businesses who need to maybe borrow money to expand. And then when that expansion kicks in, they're able, they recoup that. I mean, that creates a negative pressure on the private sector. When they don't have access to capital to expand, they can't expand, which means they can't hire more people, and then, inflation hits them. And so what do? They pass it along to the customer. They kick up, the price of the good. And inflation is a tax on poverty. That's all it is. It robs you of the value of your money. And so if your wages aren't going up, but the price of everything else is, all of a sudden your money doesn't go as far as it used to. And which is why it's not just this theoretical economic discussion for, policy wonks. It has real world consequences, and it's dangerous. This reckless fiscal irresponsibility.
Well, and again, as you said, it's certainly a tax on everyone. It's, in a sense, a hidden tax, almost like the VAT tax, but it hurts the poor the worst because whether you're a conservative or a liberal, and our progressive friends always tell us that they're concerned about income inequality, but if you want to make income inequality worse, recognize that if you are wealthy and you have money to spend, you can spend it on real estate, on growth stocks, on Bitcoin, on all sorts of things, and you can do the best you can to get a hedge against inflation. But if you're poor, living hand to mouth, that means that the dollars in your wallet or your pocketbook or your purse are going to be worth a whole lot less next year than they are right now. As a matter of fact, they're almost 30% less than they were 2 years ago in terms of buying the same amount of goods and services. And so for people to then, in the midst of this, Dr. Merrill Matthews say, well, inflation inflation isn't that bad. Have you gone out there and even tried to buy a turkey for Thanksgiving? And again, we were having Elizabeth Warren tell us, well, that's due to the various poultry cartel preventing.
Who knew? Who knew there was a poultry cartel?
I thought there was an oil cartel. Now there's a poultry cartel.
Yeah.
I don't believe that for a second. Do you?
So and where it really hits them, of course, is rent. Because so many of them don't own houses,
Right.
they rent and
Right.
so forth, and the rent is going up significantly, and that really that becomes a real struggle for them. So we may in the near future see some homeless. There is money in the federal in some of the pandemic spending to be able to get it out to people to help with rent. That
got stuck.
That got stuck,
Yes, it
and
did.
they're now trying. They've got a lot of it left over, but they weren't able to get most of it out, and it's been a real problem.
We've been talking about supply chain. We've talked about inflation, but I thought for just a minute I'd get your comment, because here's a comment and a very good commentary from Dr. Angelique Coetzee. And you might say, well, who is she? Well, she's the chair of the South African Medical Association, and she's the one that really brought attention to the variant. Do I say it the way Joe Biden says it? Omicron or Omicron? Yeah, whatever. Everybody's got a different way of pronouncing it. But Omicron variant, and she's just horrified because she said, look, there are some patients we've had. They have had very minor symptoms, and we were at, I think, probably fair to say, almost at DEFCON 3 2 days after that. And if you don't think so, look at what happened to the stock market a week ago. Dropped, 900 points. And she's very upset, in this case, really talking more about these various limitations that the UK have placed upon flights out of South Africa. But look at what Joe Biden's done in the last couple of weeks.
Yes, and her point was these appear to be fairly mild cases so far. So it seems to be the initial experience is that it seems to be more contagious, but it seems to be fairly mild. And of course, we've got several cases now in the U.S. And those cases, talking about the stock market dropped when Anthony Fauci mentioned that they had the first case in the U.S. I think that was Tuesday. Stock market dropped again.
Yeah.
But these people, I think most of them have been vaccinated, and they said they're mild, and one person had a little bit mild to moderate symptoms. And it's back to the issue of we're probably going to have to live with COVID for a long time. We got, you got vaccines. A lot of us have been exposed to it and had the disease, and so you've got natural immunities. And I suspect it's going to be more like the flu, which is we'll see it pop up every now and then, and we have some treatments and we have some vaccines, and we just got to live with it.
Yes. Well, and again, if you look at those states which seem to have the lowest percentages right now, it's Florida. Well, remember when that was the whipping boy for a long time?
Yeah.
And now
Neanderthal thinking
Yes.
was what President Biden accused the state of Florida of.
And again, we're talking about, I've lost track of all the boosters because, we've talked about a third, and I've heard people talking about a fourth booster already. And, of course, now they're suggesting maybe Moderna's a little better than Pfizer. Just all the what-ifs that are coming out of that. But anyway, I just thought we would at least acknowledge that since Omicron has been in the news for a week, the person that actually is the chairperson of the South African Medical Association said, wait a minute, hair on fire, you're all overreacting. I know you're surprised about that, but nevertheless.
Yeah, right.
Let's take a break. I want to talk a little bit about elections. Dr. Merrill Matthews has done some research on that, on the 2020 elections. Have some other questions as well. Does crime pay? Well, I think we know the answer to that, but we'll get to those issues right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, and again, we're going to get into a couple of issues. One by Dr. Merrill Matthews, why more than 500,000 2020 election votes didn't count. A lot of that gets back to these mail-in ballots, and we talked about recently individuals, in one case, a House election, this was in the Democratic side, losing by 5 votes when 1,400 votes were rejected, mail-in ballots. We'll get to that in just a minute, but we were talking about the virus and the variants and the vaccine. So I thought for just a minute I might come back to first of all, Lathan Watts talking about what they're doing at First Liberty in terms of the mandate, but also I've also pulled up here, if you go to firstliberty.org and then look at current cases, the first one up is the Maine school choice case, which is going to the Supreme Court. So can you do a twofer for us there?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me do the vaccines quickly first, and then I'll do the SCOTUS case. So on our website, there's also a free download, a PDF that shows you how to request a religious exemption if you have religious convictions that prevent you from taking this vaccine. So we encourage everybody to download that, read it, use it before you contact us, because frankly, we're just inundated. We don't have the manpower to handle all the requests for help. So that's free and available to you. As far as litigation on the vaccine mandate, we represent 35 Navy SEALs. We're suing the Department of Defense. The DOD has threatened to end these guys' careers for not taking the vaccine. We also, sued on the OSHA mandate. So those things are moving forward right now. So we're very, very busy. All the while, we have a Supreme Court argument next week.
And for our listeners in Maine, they may be familiar with it, but educate the rest of the country.
So in the state of Maine, there are parts of that state that are fairly rural, where there aren't enough students to justify building and operating an ISD, a school district, a high school. And so the state gives basically a tuition scholarship to families who live in those areas, so the families can then pay to send their kids to a school somewhere else, unless
it's Christian.
They choose to send to a religious school.
Yeah.
So we're challenging that provision in Maine, and it's going to the United States Supreme Court. We have an oral argument next week. So we'll be arguing that along with Institute for Justice. We're co-counsel with Institute for Justice on that case. And the Supreme Court ruled in not last session, maybe 2 sessions ago, a case out of Montana, very similar to this, in the Espinoza decision, that says if you're going to have a program like this, you cannot exclude religious institutions from it. Now, since then, some of the lower courts have kind of split, saying, okay, well, you can't exclude them simply based on their religious status, just because they're a religious school, but it might be okay for you to exclude them because you're trying to keep the money from being going towards a religious use. And so there's kind of a circuit split on that issue, and that's what I expect will likely be the thrust of the argument. And I think that's probably why the Supreme Court took the case, to clarify after Espinoza. No, when we said you can't discriminate against religious institutions, we mean you can't discriminate against religious institutions.
Yes.
And there's a previous Supreme Court, Trinity Lutheran, where there was a government program, Trinity Lutheran Christian Church, and operated a daycare and wanted a grant to help, I think, resurface their playground.
Right.
And they tried to prevent them from getting it, saying you're religious, we can't give you, government funds. It's been very clear.
I think it's very clear from all these cases, but it seems like they keep popping up, just like the whack-a-mole.
Exactly. So, the court has basically, over several cases, said, look, the states don't have to have programs like this, okay? You're not required to do this. But if you do, you cannot exclude religion from it.
Yes.
The government's responsibility towards religion is to be neutral towards it. It can't prefer it, but it can't discriminate against it either. So the state of Maine, you want to help families, who live in an area where there's not a school, be able to send their kids to a school, great. Go ahead and do that. But you can't tell them they can't choose a religious school. You don't have to have this program. You can decide to address this problem some other way. But if this is how you're going to do it, you cannot discriminate against religious institutions.
Again, some of our older people listening to this remember the GI Bill. And when you used the GI Bill, you could go to Notre Dame or Georgetown, which were Catholic, or you could go to Baylor, which was Baptist, or you could go to the University of Texas, or you could go to Vanderbilt, which is a private school, or you could go to Harvard, Yale, wherever. And there was no distinction. And it seems to me that this should be pretty easy. But again, you never can predict what the Supreme Court's going to do. So oral arguments next week. Kelly Shackelford will be with us on Friday, so you might tell him I want him to educate us a little bit on how those arguments went, because it's a good, very important case. It's one that you should pray about. And if you go to firstliberty.org, then just go to current cases. The first one up is the Maine school choice case. So very important. Dr. Merrill Matthews, let's talk about the election. And one of the things that we look at is 560,826. I guess that's the number you got there. Mail-in ballots were rejected during the 2020 presidential election. Now, there's some reasons for that. So educate us if you might.
Right. The U.S. Elections Assistance Commission, this has been around since 2002, passed as legislation, and it's meant because under the Constitution, elections are state controlled. They're run by states. So this is just meant to be for the federal government to sort of see what administrative things are going on in states and to sort of tally what happens with elections and just kind of get the sense of what happened. So they release their report. If they go to pointofview.net and they click on this piece, I've got a link to that in there so they can find that. It's a long report. It's a couple hundred pages, but it goes through and looks at various things that the states were doing plus the votes. And it found that there were across the states 560,000 votes that were not counted because of various issues that came in. People didn't fill it out right. Other things, the U.S. Postal Office didn't put a stamp on it, so they couldn't tell if it had been postmarked by a certain time. The U.S. Post Office didn't get it to them in time, and other things, even though it may have been mailed in time. So there was a number of reasons for that. People did not signing it, not filling it out right, and so forth. So the point I make is I went through and checked every state, Trump versus Biden in every state. In no state with those various differences would that have made the difference in the election. I just wanted to make sure that was the case, and it wouldn't have made a difference in the election. But it certainly could have made a difference in some local or even congressional elections, things that are local and come up with smaller votes. And that's where I think it becomes important for people. And I say in there, you should, if you have the ability to go in and vote in person, where there are poll watchers, there are people who can help you, walk you through the process and so forth, you should do that. If you don't have that option, second best is mail-in. The Democrats are trying to move us to all mail-in votes, and you have a lot of problems. Over 500,000 Americans vote and ultimately didn't count in this.
And again, I've used the more recent example. Here you had the House election. This is the primary, Democratic primary. Almost always use the examples from the primary. If you look at my booklet on voter fraud, I always use the ones with the Democrats and usually the primaries. Because if you start talking about voter fraud or voter inequities, they say, well, that's voter suppression. I said, no, these are all Democrats. So, and this one is a House election. It's in the 20th Congressional District. That's old Alcee Hastings' position. And he was kind of a very safe Democratic seat. So really the primary is it. But here you had an election, shows how close they are, 11,662 to 11,657, 5 votes. But now the rest of the story. 1,400 votes were rejected. 1,253 mail-in votes were tossed because they missed the election deadline, and it's possible they mailed it on time, but it didn't come in. 294 were postmarked before Election Day, but they didn't get there. And then you had some that had 708 missing or illegible postmarks. The point you're making in this piece, and the point this one would make, is if you can go and vote in person, that is the best way to go. And this push to try to have everything with a mail-in ballot is really a disaster.
And the good news is most states now have voting, pre-election voting, so you can go and vote early for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or something of that nature, and that you miss the lines and so forth. So it allows you to go through and get that voting done, but it allows you to get it done in person. Make sure they have that tabulation, and you walk out, and then you're 99.999% sure that vote's going to get counted.
Well, and the other advantage of that is, like you said, you got somebody watching on the precinct, so there's no funny business theoretically taking place. And more importantly, when you start doing this idea of vote harvesting, which is now legal in some of these states, Lathan Watts, you can't be assured that somebody wasn't coerced into that. And some of the lawsuits we talked about just the other day were from individuals that were in some of these nursing homes and just filled them all out, forged the signatures, and then mailed
them in. Yeah, exactly. You know, if you're considering voting by mail, take a little while and decide how much. Try to put a dollar value on how much you think your vote is worth. Right? Maybe it's how much you paid in taxes. Write a check to yourself for that amount, and then go mail it to yourself. If you wouldn't trust the post office to make sure that money got to you, why, in the name of all things holy, would you trust them to make sure your vote got counted?
Again, I know some of our listeners are in states which allow everyone to vote by mail, but I just think it's a bad idea. Dr. Merrill Matthews' piece, I think, gives some very good reasons why you should not trust it. Let's take a break. Does crime pay? We'll talk about that right after this.
Of the books around my house meant for grandkids, Eric Carle's The Very Hungry Caterpillar has been read the most, often several times at one sitting. The babies want to poke their little fingers through the nibble holes in the various foods the caterpillar eats. The older ones want to count the fruits, identify the days the caterpillar consumes them, and name the other treats he eats his way through. Then, children and adults alike gasp at the beautiful butterfly, the book's final illustration, which Washington Post writer Emily Langer describes as a panorama spread over 2 pages in which light seems to shine through the creature's wings as if through the stained glass windows of a European cathedral. Writer and illustrator Eric Carle died 6 months ago. Ms. Langer, who wrote his obituary for the Post, describes his hallmark collage illustrations, which he created by layering hand-painted tissue paper as part of his effort to show children a world that was filled with beauty despite the darkness he had intimately known. Mr. Carle was the son of German immigrants to the United States. The family returned to Stuttgart in Nazi Germany. He remembers hiding in a cellar during World War II as bombs fell. He told National Public Radio, during the war there were no colors. Everything was gray and brown. But an art teacher secretly introduced him to Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse and other famous painters disdained by the Nazis. After a New York advertising career that began in 1952, Eric Carle in 1967 illustrated Brown Bear, What Do You See? And found his calling. The child inside me, he said, was beginning to come joyfully back to life. Mr. Carle wrote The Very Hungry Caterpillar in 1969. Ms. Langer's piece points to the caterpillar's eating frenzy as a reaction to wartime deprivation and suggests the story may be Christian allegory, a message of hope. It's no wonder we're still reading it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that, again, each one of the articles we've been talking about is on the website. We've already sent you to, of course, firstliberty.org. Also send you to ipi.org. And as you go down the list, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is our 5th article. This one is by Dr. Merrill Matthews as well. In San Francisco and Chicago, crime pays very well. Now, I'm holding up our booklet that we put out a number of years ago on a biblical view on criminal justice, which I need to update now that all these things have unfolded. But I do quote somebody that I know, Dr. Matthews, you know, Morgan Reynolds, who back in 1990 really helped me understand that this idea of crime doesn't pay. Oh, yes, it does, because he points out that, yes, some crimes are irrational, but lots of times they are actually calculated. And if the expected punishment is low, then various individuals might commit the crime. And so to figure out your possible payment, you have to then calculate it by multiplying 4 probabilities. The probability of being arrested for a crime, the probability of being prosecuted, the probability of being convicted, and the probability of going to prison. And he ran the numbers back in 1990, so that's 30 years ago now. And it really proved very easily that, for example, burglary pays very well. Well, let's fast forward now to San Francisco, Walnut Creek, California, Chicago, on Michigan Avenue, and a number of other places in which you get this smash and grab. And these individuals right now have been able to get off pretty easily with a lot of high-end real estate and high-end equipment and tools and hammers and jewels
Gucci
and everything,
purses, jewelry, everything.
And so, again, one of the reasons you're bringing it up is if you've been for some time talking about the fact that we need to defund the police and have fewer police officers and less security, guess what happens?
It's exactly what happens. And we warned them this would be the case.
Yes, we did.
And, you know, it's interesting because since the George Floyd issue, liberals sort of stepped back and said, well, these aren't really riots, or these aren't protests. People are doing this, and they're breaking into homes and burning down buildings and things like that, but that will pass. Well, what's happened now is they've gotten the message that they are not going to be prosecuted for this. And in San Francisco, you have what apparently has become organized crime with gangs of 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 people going into malls, going into high-end stores with hammers, breaking the glass, taking whatever they want, threatening the employees if they try to respond, and then walking out with it, and then going and selling some of this on Amazon and other things. And it's happening day after day, to the point that Governor Newsom has stepped up and said about a few months ago, we're going to have to address this issue. We're going to this is not going to happen anymore. I think it's the head of the Police Officers Association in San Francisco said the reason this is happening is because our Attorney General in the state said we're not going to prosecute these crimes. We're going to pull back on that, and they just essentially gave them an open door for doing it.
And you have these propositions that say if it's less than $950,
right,
then you're not going to prosecute. And so that's the first issue. And again, you might say, well, San Francisco, or Chicago, again,
Chicago's another one.
North
Minneapolis,
Michigan Avenue. But some of this is happening in Nordstroms. They're happening in suburban neighborhoods. They're happening in Beverly Hills. And so in some respects, you're talking about a level of crime and boldness that we've never really seen before.
Right. And some of the district attorneys, when they came up and they said, we're not going to prosecute as felonies some of these things, we may not even really prosecute them at all. They put, in Dallas, they put a $750 limit, I think, on it, roughly $950 in California. But what they essentially tried to say was some of these people are poor and they need to be able to go in and get some food or some things like that. Well, if you're getting a Gucci purse, you're not starving.
Louis Vuitton, those kinds of things, yeah.
And even to the point that in San Francisco, they went in and broke into a Home Depot to and stole hammers and other things so that they could go break the glass to get in some of these stores.
Yeah, go in and steal the hammers so then you can use the hammers to then break up all the jewelry and then run out there. And the boldness, Lathan, is amazing. I don't know if you go on YouTube as much as I do, but I find sometimes some great videos. And there are some videos where there's a security guard and they maybe will try to slow them down, but they don't dare stop them because one that tried to the other day was killed.
Yeah, they're outnumbered and they're outgunned.
And so that...
CVS has closed stores in San Francisco,
Walgreens, yes,
all because they just kept continually getting robbed. And, on another little show that I do, we call this another story from the Department of Entirely Predictable Consequences. I mean, who would have thought if you tell people they're not going to be prosecuted for crimes that they would go out and commit crimes? Literally everyone thought that. That's who thought that, except for the geniuses who ran on this issue saying, and we need to reform bail so you don't have to make bail to get out of jail. So even if you do get caught and we put you in jail, we'll let you go anyway, and just hopefully show up for your court date.
And let's make sure the mayor of Oakland, California, gets some airtime.
There we go.
Because she's considered one of the most liberal mayors progressive mayors in the country, and she's now come up and said, that defund the police thing we were doing, we're going to change that now.
Yes.
And I'm just stunned at how they have to flip because they're losing the city, they're losing people. On the other hand, it just makes them look like fools when that happens.
Well, and we're starting to see some of these candidates that run supporting the police, whether it's the mayor of New York or whether it's what happened up in Minneapolis or a number of other places, that common sense is breaking out all over the place. And I think that program's called Snarky Parenthetical. So if people want to hear you untamed and untethered, that is another place where you can find some of that. First, of course, firstliberty.org. But Dr. Merrill Matthews, again, let's talk about what's at ipi.org, because when you go today, you're going to see, first of all, I got to mention, you start out by talking about Dick Tracy. We've got a picture of Dick Tracy. So if you go to the website right now, you scroll down, Karen put a picture of Dick Tracy up there, Crime Does Pay, because he's the one that popularized the slogan, Crime Doesn't Pay.
Right.
Sadly. Dick Tracy, I hate to tell you, but in 2021, unfortunately, crime does pay.
So there's a number of articles up there. It's all free. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we do cover a range of different public policy issues. So people are free to go to ipi.org. We have a number of articles up there. They're free to click on that. We occasionally have Zoom calls, as we did on Wednesday with Tevi Troy, talking about wokeness in the medical profession and how that's moving forward.
Yes. And there's also one at First Liberty Live, and I thought that one was very good too, and that was yesterday. So if you certainly would like to watch a little bit more than just the 2 hours of Point of View, we give you a couple of places where you can watch those and listen to those as well. Just about out of time, so let me give you some action items. First of all, Penedexter's commentary today on Viewpoints. You can read that. Of course, mine is up there on just a real concern that I've got right now, that we could be losing our liberty because of some of the precedents that we've talked about. Nothing too dramatic there, other than just to say the things we've been talking about for some time. But as you go to the website, you'll notice there's a take action item. And if you have not taken the time this week, let's encourage you, just as we get off the air in about a minute, to just go there and hit the button that says Take Action, scroll down, and then contact your senators. There's a place where you can put in your zip code. I'm typing it in right now, and up pops my 2 United States senators, and also a letter. And so if you say, well, I don't know what to say, well, we give you an idea. If you have a better idea, you can edit it all you want. You scroll down a little bit further, hit submit, and you have actually done your civic duty. So we've made it very easy for you. Don't take the time, if you could, over the next couple of days to actually read some of these, because it's worth taking some time to read the articles that we've posted today by our roundtable guests. Let me just mention that, as I said, next Friday we're going to have Penedexter, Kelly Shackelford back. Boy, it's been a long time since we've had them. And maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that case in Maine. So all of it is available at the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, don't forget, we're getting close to year end. And if you can help us out financially, we would greatly appreciate that. Glad to have Andrew back as our engineer and Steve as our producer. Have a great weekend. We look forward to seeing you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the